True Scary Deep Woods Stories. Story 1. The Silent Howl. Deep within the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely filters through, there exists a place that the locals avoid at all costs. They speak of it in hushed tones, calling it the Hollow. It's a small valley, hidden from the world, where the wind never blows and the animals never tread. A group of hikers, eager for adventure, decided to explore this untouched wilderness. They were experienced and well prepared, or so they thought. As they ventured deeper into the hollow, an eerie silence settled over them. Not a bird sang, not a leaf rustled. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As night fell, the group made camp, but sleep did not come easy. In the dead of night, a sound echoed through the trees, a low, mournful howl, unlike anything they had ever heard. It was close, too close. The howling continued, growing louder and more frantic. The hikers, gripped by fear, tried to leave, but they found that the path had vanished, replaced by an endless sea of trees. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. The forest was alive with shadows, and something was watching them, something that didn't belong to this world. By morning, only one hiker stumbled out of the hollow barely alive, with no memory of how they escaped. The others were never seen again. To this day, the survivor refuses to speak of what happened, but the hollowed look in their eyes tells a story of unimaginable terror. Story 2. The Whispers in the Pines. In the heart of the Pacific Northwest, where the pine forests stretch as far as the eye can see, there is a legend that has been passed down through generations. They say that the trees themselves are alive, not just with life, but with something darker, something ancient. A family, new to the area, bought a cabin deep in these woods, seeking peace and solitude. But from the first night, they knew something was wrong. The wind carried voices, soft whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. At first, they thought it was just the wind playing tricks on them, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They spoke in an unknown language, a chorus of voices that rose and fell with the wind. The family tried to ignore it, but sleep became impossible as the voices filled the night. One evening, the youngest daughter disappeared, vanishing without a trace. The parents searched desperately, but the forest offered no clues. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking them. In a last desperate attempt, the father followed the whispers deep into the woods, hoping to find his daughter. What he found was a clearing, surrounded by ancient pines, their bark carved with strange symbols. In the center of the clearing stood his daughter, her eyes vacant, her face expressionless. As he approached, the trees began to move, closing in around him. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of his daughter's voice, joining the whispers. Story 3. The Cabin That Shouldn't Exist. In the remote forests of Alaska, where the wilderness remains largely unexplored, there are stories of a cabin that appears only to those who are lost. It's said to be a place of refuge, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. But those who enter the cabin are never seen again. A seasoned trapper, familiar with the area, found himself caught in a sudden blizzard. Disoriented and freezing, he stumbled through the snow, searching for shelter. Through the blinding snow, he saw a light. A cabin, warm and inviting, with smoke curling from the chimney. Grateful for the unexpected refuge, he hurried inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire blazing in the hearth and a table set for one. Exhausted, he collapsed into a chair by the fire, warming his frozen limbs. But as the warmth seeped into his bones, he noticed something odd. The cabin was too perfect. The fire never dimmed, the food never cooled, and there was no sign of the storm outside. Days passed, or perhaps it was weeks. Time lost all meaning. The trapper realized he was a prisoner in the cabin, unable to leave. Every attempt to open the door or windows was futile. They wouldn't budge. He was trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, where the normal rules of the world no longer applied. Eventually, the trapper's mind began to unravel. He heard footsteps on the roof, whispers in the walls, and saw shadowy figures moving just out of sight. In the end, he succumbed to madness, and the cabin claimed him, just as it had claimed others before him. The cabin is still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble upon it. Story 4. The Watchers. In the dark woods of the Ozarks, there is a legend about the Watchers, mysterious beings that dwell deep within the forest, observing those who dare to enter. They are not human, nor are they animal. They are something in between, something ancient and malevolent. A group of friends, curious about the legend, decided to spend a weekend camping in the Ozarks, deep in the heart of the Watchers' territory. They dismissed the warnings of the locals as superstition, confident that nothing could harm them. The first day was uneventful, but as night fell, they began to feel an uneasy presence. The forest, which had been full of life during the day, was now deathly silent. The friends sat around the campfire, trying to shake off their growing fear, when they noticed movement in the shadows beyond the firelight. Dark shapes flitted between the trees, too fast and too large to be animals. The Watchers were real, and they were not pleased with the intruders. As the night wore on, the friends found themselves surrounded, the Watchers closing in. They could hear the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the low guttural growls of creatures that should not exist. Panic set in as they realized they were being hunted. One by one, they were taken, dragged into the darkness by unseen hands. By morning, only one friend remained, shaking and terrified, with no memory of what had happened to the others. The forest had claimed them, and the Watchers had returned to their silent vigil, waiting for the next group of unwary souls to enter their domain. Story 5. The Man in the Shadows. There's a stretch of forest in the Pacific Northwest where locals warn travelers not to linger after dark. Known as the Shadow Woods, it's said to be haunted by a figure known only as the Man in the Shadows. He's not a ghost, but something worse, something that can move between worlds. A pair of backpackers, unaware of the local legends, set up camp deep in the woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. It wasn't long before they saw him, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of their campfire light. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the light, but as the night wore on, the figure grew bolder, moving closer with each passing hour. He never spoke, never made a sound, but his presence filled them with dread. By the time they realized they were not alone, it was too late. The Man in the Shadows had claimed them, pulling them into his dark world, leaving nothing behind but a cold, empty campsite. Story 6. The Forest of Eyes. In the heart of the Black Forest in Germany, there is a place that even the bravest hunters avoid. Known as the Forest of Eyes, it's a small, dense patch of woods where the trees seem to watch your every move. A group of tourists, intrigued by the local legends, decided to visit this infamous forest. As they ventured deeper, they began to feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The feeling was so intense that it became impossible to ignore. Everywhere they looked, they saw eyes, carved into the trees, hidden in the shadows, and reflected in the dark pools of water. The eyes seemed to follow them, growing more numerous with each step. As night fell, the tourists realized they were hopelessly lost. The forest, once merely unsettling, now felt alive and malevolent. The trees closed in around them, the eyes growing larger and more menacing. By dawn, the tourists were never found. The locals say the forest claimed them, adding their souls to the countless others trapped within its gaze. Story 7. The Wailing Woman. Deep in the woods of the American South, there's a legend about a woman who was wronged by her lover and left to die alone in the wilderness. Her spirit, filled with rage and sorrow, is said to haunt the woods, wailing in despair. They call her the Wailing Woman. A young couple, out for a weekend getaway in the woods, stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It seemed like the perfect place to spend the night, but as darkness fell, they heard a sound that chilled them to the bone, a woman's wail, long and mournful, echoing through the trees. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but the wailing grew louder, more desperate. The sound was coming closer, circling the cabin. The couple tried to leave, but the forest had changed. The path was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of trees. The wailing became unbearable, driving them to the brink of madness. By morning, the cabin was empty, the couple gone. The Wailing Woman had taken them, and their screams joined hers, forever echoing through the dark woods. Story 8. The Curse of the Wendigo. In the vast forests of Canada, there is a creature that the indigenous people fear above all others: the Wendigo. It is said to be a spirit of the forest, a monster born of greed and hunger that preys on those who venture too deep into the wilderness. A hunter, eager to make a name for himself, decided to track down the Wendigo. He was warned by the elders, but he ignored their advice, confident in his abilities. Days passed as he hunted through the dense forest, But the Wendigo always seemed one step ahead, leaving only traces of its presence: broken branches, claw marks on trees, and the lingering stench of decay. The hunter became obsessed, driven mad by the hunt. In his desperation, he ventured into the heart of the Wendigo's territory, a place where the trees twisted and the air was thick with the smell of death. That night, the Wendigo came for him. It was a creature of nightmares, with long, skeletal limbs, glowing eyes, and a hunger that could never be sated. The hunter's screams echoed through the forest, but no one came to his aid. By morning he was gone, leaving only blood-stained snow and the lingering curse of the Wendigo. Story 9. The Cabin in the Clearing. In the remote woods of Maine, there is a cabin that appears to those who are lost and desperate. It is a place of last resort, offering shelter from the unforgiving wilderness. But those who enter the cabin never leave. A young woman, separated from her hiking group, stumbled upon the cabin as night began to fall. Exhausted and frightened, she welcomed the sight of the warm light glowing from within. The cabin was small but well-maintained, with a fire blazing in the hearth and a bed neatly made. Grateful for the shelter, she quickly fell asleep. But her rest was anything but peaceful. Her dreams were filled with visions of the cabin's previous occupants, all of whom had met terrible fates. She saw their faces twisted in fear, their eyes pleading for help that never came. She awoke with a start, only to find that she was no longer alone. The cabin was filled with shadows, moving and whispering just beyond the firelight. The woman tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The cabin had claimed her, just as it had claimed all those before her. By morning, the cabin was gone, and so was she. Story 10. The Lost Village. Deep in the woods of Eastern Europe, there is a village that has been lost to time. Once a thriving community, it was abandoned after a mysterious plague wiped out its inhabitants. Now it stands as a ghost town, hidden deep within the forest, forgotten by the world. A group of explorers, intrigued by the legend, set out to find this lost village. After days of trekking through the dense forest, they'd finally stumbled upon it. The village was eerily preserved, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished. The houses stood silent and empty, their windows dark and lifeless. The explorers entered one of the houses, finding it fully furnished, with a table set for a meal that had long since rotted away. As night fell, the air grew thick with the smell of decay, and a strange mist began to rise from the ground. The explorers quickly realized they were not alone. Shadows moved through the village, figures half seen through the mist, their faces twisted in agony. The plague had not just killed the villagers, it had trapped their souls in eternal torment. The explorers tried to flee, but the mist closed in around them, choking them with the stench of death. By morning, the village was once again silent, with no sign of the explorers. The forest had claimed them, just as it had claimed the villagers long ago. Story 11. The Lurker in the Trees. In the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest, there are stories of a creature that lurks in the trees, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It is said to be a shapeshifter, able to blend into its surroundings, making it nearly impossible to see until it's too late. A group of loggers, working deep in the forest, began to notice strange things happening around their camp. Tools went missing, food supplies were raided, and at night they heard the sound of something large moving through the trees. At first, they thought it was just a bear, but the tracks they found were unlike anything they had ever seen, long, clawed, and deeply embedded in the earth. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The loggers started to see fleeting glimpses of something moving through the trees, something that seemed to be following them. One by one, the loggers began to disappear, dragged into the darkness by the unseen creature. Those who remained tried to flee, but the forest had become a labyrinth, twisting and changing to keep them trapped. By the time help arrived, the camp was empty, with only the shredded remains of the loggers' gear left behind. The lurker had claimed them, adding their fear to its collection. Story 12. The Ghost Lights. In the swamps of Louisiana, there are lights that float just above the water, flickering like fireflies. The locals call them ghost lights, and they warn that following them leads only to death. A group of teenagers, eager to prove the legend wrong, set out to find the source of the lights. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they ventured deep into the swamp, laughing off the warnings of the old-timers. As night fell, the ghost lights appeared, dancing just out of reach. The teenagers, thinking it was a trick, followed the lights deeper into the swamp. But the further they went, the more disoriented they became. The lights, once playful, grew erratic, leading them in circles. The swamp, which had been alive with the sounds of nature, grew silent. Panic set in as the teenagers realized they were lost. The ghost lights flickered closer, revealing shadowy figures moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights. One by one, the teenagers vanished, swallowed by the darkness of the swamp. By dawn, the swamp was silent, the ghost lights gone, and the teenagers were never seen again. Story 13. The Witch's Tree. In the remote forests of New England, there is an ancient oak tree that is said to be the resting place of a powerful witch. The tree is twisted and gnarled, its bark blackened as if by fire. The locals say that anyone who dares to disturb the tree will incur the wrath of the witch, whose spirit still haunts the forest. A curious traveler, passing through the area, decided to visit the infamous tree, dismissing the warnings as mere superstition. He approached the tree at dusk, marveling at its size and age. But as he reached out to touch the bark, a sudden chill ran through the air. The forest, once peaceful, grew dark and foreboding. The traveler felt a presence, something ancient and angry, watching him. The wind began to howl, and the trees around him seemed to come alive, their branches reaching out like claws. The traveler tried to flee, but the forest had changed. The path was gone, and the trees closed in around him. The last thing he heard was the sound of a woman's voice, whispering curses into the wind. By morning, the traveler was found, his body twisted and broken at the base of the witch's tree. The locals say that the witch had claimed another soul, adding his torment to the dark magic that binds her to the forest. Story 14. The Face in the Window. In the backwoods of Appalachia, there is an old, abandoned farmhouse that is said to be haunted by the ghost of a young woman who died under mysterious circumstances. The locals say that if you approach the house at night, you can see her face in the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for someone to join her. A group of thrill-seekers, eager for a scare, decided to visit the farmhouse. They arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and red. The house, standing silent and alone in the clearing, seemed to be waiting for them. As they approached, they could feel the temperature drop, a chill that seeped into their bones. One of the group, a skeptic, boldly walked up to the house, peering into the windows. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw it, the pale, ghostly face of a woman staring back at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and despair. The group, terrified, tried to leave, but the forest had other plans. The trees closed in, the path back to their car vanishing in the darkness. The face in the window watched them, her presence growing stronger with each passing moment. By morning, the farmhouse was empty, and the group was never seen again. The locals say that the woman had finally found the company she had been waiting for, her lonely vigil in the window coming to an end. Story 15. The Screaming Forest. In a remote part of Siberia, there is a forest where the wind never stops blowing, and the trees seem to scream as the wind howls through their branches. The locals call it the Screaming Forest, and they believe it is cursed. A group of scientists, intrigued by the phenomenon, decided to study the forest, hoping to discover the source of the strange sounds. They set up camp deep within the forest, their equipment measuring the wind speed and direction. But as night fell, they began to hear something that wasn't just the wind, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from the trees themselves. The forest, once merely eerie, became a place of terror. The trees, bent and twisted by the wind, seemed to move of their own accord. Shadows flitted between the trunks, and the screaming grew louder, more desperate. The scientists, driven by fear, tried to leave, but the wind had become a storm, trapping them within the forest. By morning, their equipment lay scattered and broken, and the scientists were gone. The screaming forest had claimed them, adding their voices to the eternal wail that haunts the woods. Story 16. The Disappearing Path. In the forests of the Scottish Highlands, there is a path that is said to disappear without warning, leading those who walk it into another world, one from which they never return. A hiker, new to the area, decided to explore this infamous path, dismissing the warnings as mere folklore. As he walked, the path seemed normal, winding through the beautiful, lush forest. But as he ventured deeper, the path began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above him, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sounds of the forest faded away. The hiker realized too late that he was lost. The path, once clear, had vanished, replaced by an endless sea of trees. Panic set in as he tried to find his way back, but the forest had become a maze, leading him in circles. The trees, once welcoming, now seemed to close in around him, their trunks twisting and turning like a living wall. By nightfall, the hiker was never seen again. The locals say that the path had claimed him, taking him to a place where time and space no longer existed. Story 17. The Beast of the Blackwood. In the dense forests of the British Isles, there is a legend of a creature known as the Beast of the Blackwood. It is said to be a massive, wolf-like creature with eyes that glow like embers and a hunger that can never be sated. A group of hunters, eager to prove their skills, set out to track the beast, armed with the best weapons and equipment money could buy. They were confident, laughing off the warnings of the locals. But as they ventured deeper into the Blackwood, the forest grew silent, and an unnatural fog began to roll in, obscuring their vision. The hunters quickly realized they were not alone. The beast was watching them, stalking them through the fog. They could hear its low growl, feel its hot breath on the back of their necks, but every time they turned around, there was nothing there. As night fell, the hunters tried to find their way back, but the fog had become a wall, trapping them within the forest. One by one, they were picked off, their screams echoing through the trees. By morning, only one hunter remained, shaking and terrified, with no memory of how he escaped. The beast had spared him, but the forest had claimed the rest. Story 18. The Watcher on the Ridge. In the Rocky Mountains, there is a ridge that is said to be haunted by a mysterious figure known as the Watcher. The locals say that the Watcher appears only at night, standing on the ridge, watching over the valley below. Those who see the Watcher are said to be cursed, doomed to disappear without a trace. A lone hiker, unaware of the legend, set up camp near the ridge, hoping to enjoy the solitude of the mountains. As night fell, he noticed a figure standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the moonlight. At first, he thought it was another hiker, but as he watched, the figure remained perfectly still, never moving, never making a sound. The hiker began to feel uneasy, the presence of the Watcher filling him with a deep sense of dread. As the night wore on, the figure on the ridge began to move, slowly making its way down the slope toward the hiker's camp. Panic set in as the hiker realized he was being watched. He tried to leave, but the ridge seemed to grow taller, the valley stretching out before him like an endless sea. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the Watcher, standing just outside his tent, its eyes glowing in the night. By morning, the hiker was gone, and the Watcher had returned to its vigil on the ridge. Story 19. The Witch's Familiar. In the deep woods of the Ozarks, there is a story of a witch who lived in a small, secluded cabin. She was said to have a familiar, a creature that was neither animal nor human, but something in between. The locals avoided the area, fearing the witch and her dark magic. A group of friends, curious about the legend, decided to visit the witch's cabin. They arrived at dusk, the forest already growing dark and ominous. The cabin was old and decrepit, its roof sagging and its windows broken. But as they approached, they felt a sudden chill, the air thick with the smell of decay. Inside the cabin, they found strange symbols carved into the walls and the remnants of old rituals scattered across the floor. As night fell, the friends began to hear strange noises, scratching, whispering, and the soft padding of footsteps just outside the door. The familiar had returned, and it was not pleased to find intruders in its home. The friends tried to leave, but the forest had become a maze, the trees twisting and turning to keep them trapped. The familiar, a creature of nightmares with glowing eyes and sharp claws, stalked them through the woods, picking them off one by one. By morning, the cabin was empty, the friends gone. The witch's familiar had claimed them, adding their fear to the dark magic that bound it to the forest. Story 20. The Forest of Bones. In the wilds of Montana, there is a stretch of forest known as the Forest of Bones. It is said to be a place where the dead do not rest and where the ground is littered with the bones of those who have entered and never returned. A pair of hunters, eager for a challenge, decided to explore the forest, dismissing the warnings of the locals as mere superstition. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to notice strange things: bones scattered across the ground, skulls peeking out from beneath the leaves, and the unmistakable stench of death. The forest, once peaceful, grew darker, the trees twisting and turning like a living wall. The hunters realized too late that they were not alone. The dead, restless and angry, had risen from their graves, seeking revenge on the living. The forest became a nightmare, the ground shifting and moving beneath their feet, the trees closing in around them. The hunters tried to flee, but the forest had become a labyrinth, leading them in circles. By morning, the forest was silent, the bones of the hunters added to the countless others that littered the ground. The forest of bones had claimed them, their souls forever trapped in its dark embrace. Story 21. The Haunted Lake. In the deep woods of northern Michigan, there is a lake that is said to be haunted by the spirits of those who drowned in its icy waters. The locals call it Dead Man's Lake, and they warn that anyone who swims in its waters at night will never return. A group of college students on a camping trip decided to test the legend, daring each other to swim across the lake under the light of the full moon. The water was freezing, but they laughed off the cold, confident that the legend was just a story. But as they swam, they began to feel something pulling at them from beneath the surface. The water grew darker, the cold more intense, and the laughter died in their throats. One by one, they were dragged beneath the surface, their screams swallowed by the icy depths. By morning, their bodies were found floating on the lake, their faces twisted in terror. The locals say that the spirits of Dead Man's Lake had claimed them, adding their souls to the countless others that haunt its waters. Story 22. The Phantom Campfire. In the vast forests of Canada, there is a legend of a phantom campfire that appears to those who are lost and desperate. It is said to be a beacon of hope, offering warmth and safety to those who find it. But those who sit by the fire are never seen again. A hiker, lost and freezing, stumbled upon the campfire as night began to fall. The fire was warm and inviting, with a pot of stew bubbling over the flames. Grateful for the unexpected refuge, the hiker sat down by the fire, warming his frozen limbs. But as the night wore on, he began to notice strange things. The fire never dimmed, the stew never cooled, and there was no sign of the storm outside. The hiker tried to leave, but the fire seemed to grow brighter, the flames reaching out like claws. The forest, once a place of refuge, had become a trap, and the hiker realized too late that he was not alone. Shadows moved just beyond the firelight, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. By morning, the campfire was gone, and so was the hiker. The locals say that the phantom campfire had claimed him, taking his soul to a place where time and space no longer existed. Story 23. The Howling Wind. In the Highlands of Scotland, there is a place where the wind never stops howling, and the trees seem to bend and twist in agony. The locals call it the Howling Wood, and they say that it is cursed by the spirits of those who died in a long-forgotten battle. A traveler, seeking shelter from the storm, stumbled upon the Howling Wood as night began to fall. The wind was fierce, tearing at his clothes and howling through the trees like a banshee. Desperate for shelter, he found a small cave at the edge of the wood and settled in for the night. But as he tried to sleep, the howling grew louder, more desperate. The trees outside seemed to move of their own accord, their branches scratching at the entrance of the cave like claws. The traveler realized too late that he was not alone. The spirits of the dead had risen from their graves, their howls mingling with the wind in a chorus of despair. The traveler tried to flee, but the wind had become a storm, trapping him within the wood. By morning, the cave was empty, and the traveler was never seen again. The locals say that the howling wood had claimed him, adding his voice to the eternal wail that haunts the trees. Story 24. The Lost Hunters. In the deep woods of the American South, there is a place where hunters go and never return. The locals call it the Lost Woods, and they believe that it is a place where the spirits of the animals killed by hunters come to seek revenge. A group of hunters, eager for a challenge, decided to explore the Lost Woods, dismissing the warnings of the locals as mere superstition. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to notice strange things. Footprints that appeared out of nowhere, the smell of blood in the air, and the sound of something large moving through the trees. The hunters quickly realized that they were not alone. The animals, or rather their spirits, had risen from the dead, seeking revenge on those who had wronged them. The forest became a nightmare, the trees twisting and turning like a living wall, trapping the hunters within its dark embrace. The hunters tried to flee, but the forest had become a labyrinth, leading them in circles. By morning, the forest was silent, the bodies of the hunters never found. The lost woods had claimed them, their souls forever trapped in its dark embrace. Story 25. The Ghost Road. In the remote forests of the American Midwest, there is a road that is said to be haunted by the spirits of those who died in tragic accidents. The locals call it Ghost Road, and they warn that those who drive down it at night will never return. A couple, on a late-night drive, decided to take a shortcut down Ghost Road, dismissing the warnings as mere superstition. The road was dark and winding, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. As they drove, they began to see strange things, figures standing by the side of the road, their faces pale and ghostly, their eyes filled with sorrow. The couple tried to speed up, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, the figures growing more numerous with each passing mile. The car's headlights flickered, the engine sputtering as if something was draining its power. Panic set in as the couple realized they were trapped on Ghost Road with no way out. The last thing they saw before the darkness claimed them was a figure standing in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing in the night. By morning, the car was found abandoned, the couple gone. The locals say that Ghost Road had claimed them, adding their souls to the countless others that haunt its dark and winding path. Story 26. The Mirror Pond. Deep in the forests of Vermont lies a small, perfectly still pond known to the locals as Mirror Pond. It is said that the water is so clear and reflective that it acts as a portal to another world, a dark and twisted version of our own. A young artist, drawn to the beauty of the pond, decided to camp nearby, hoping to capture its essence in her paintings. As she sat by the water's edge, sketching the landscape, she noticed something strange in the reflection, a shadowy figure standing behind her. Startled, she turned around, but no one was there. Shaking it off as a trick of the light, she continued to paint, but the figure in the reflection grew clearer, more defined. It was a dark version of herself, its eyes hollow and expression twisted into a malevolent grin. Terrified, she tried to flee, but the pond's reflection seemed to come alive, reaching out to pull her into its depths. By morning, all that was found was her easel and the half-finished painting, the water of Mirror Pond, perfectly still once again. The locals say the pond had claimed her, trapping her in the dark world beneath its surface. Story 27. The Singing Stones. In the remote forests of Ireland, there is a circle of ancient stones that the locals call the Singing Stones. The stones are said to hum a low, eerie melody, especially on nights when the moon is full. It is believed that the stones are the burial markers of an ancient tribe, and the music they emit is the lament of their restless spirits. A pair of travelers, fascinated by the legend, set out to find the stones, hoping to experience the phenomenon for themselves. After hours of trekking through the dense forest, they finally stumbled upon the stone circle, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The air was thick with tension as the stones began to hum, a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The travelers felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and dread, as if the weight of centuries of pain and suffering was pressing down on them. As the melody grew louder, the travelers realized they were not alone. Shadows moved among the stones, whispering in a language long forgotten. The travelers tried to leave, but the forest had become a maze, the path back obscured by the darkness. By morning, the stone circle was empty, the travelers gone. The singing stones had claimed them, their souls forever bound to the haunting melody that echoes through the forest. Story 28. The Cursed Clearing. In the dense woods of the Pacific Northwest, there is a clearing that the locals say is cursed. The trees around it grow twisted and gnarled, and no animals venture near it. It is said that anyone who steps into the clearing will be doomed to relive their worst nightmares, trapped in an endless loop of fear and despair. A group of campers, unaware of the curse, set up camp in the clearing, eager to enjoy the solitude of the forest. As night fell, strange things began to happen. The campers started to hear whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to come from all around them. The air grew cold, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to take on a life of their own. One by one, the campers were drawn into their worst fears, visions of past trauma, lost loved ones, and unimaginable horrors. No matter how hard they tried to escape, the clearing would not let them go. By morning, the campsite was empty, the campers gone without a trace. The locals say that the clearing had claimed them, trapping their souls in an endless nightmare from which they will never wake. Story 29. The Ghost of Hollow Creek. In the deep woods of Tennessee, there is a creek known as Hollow Creek, where the water runs cold and clear even in the heat of summer. The locals say that the creek is haunted by the ghost of a young woman who drowned there many years ago. It is said that on moonlit nights, her ghost can be seen walking along the water's edge, searching for something she lost. A fisherman, new to the area, decided to try his luck at the creek, unaware of its dark history. As he cast his line, the water suddenly grew still, the usual sounds of the forest falling silent. A thick mist began to rise from the creek, obscuring his view. Through the fog, he saw her, a pale figure, her dress flowing as if caught in a breeze that he couldn't feel. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the water with an intensity that made his blood run cold. As she neared him, the fisherman felt a sudden, overwhelming sorrow, as if the weight of her grief was pressing down on him. The ghost reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, and he felt a cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. Terrified, he fled the creek, but the feeling of cold and sorrow stayed with him long after he returned home. The locals say that the ghost of Hollow Creek had marked him, and that one day she would come to claim him, just as she had claimed others before him. Story 30. The Eyes in the Dark. In the wild forests of Alaska, there is a stretch of land where the trees grow thick and the nights are pitch black. The locals call it the Darkwood, and they warn travelers to avoid it at all costs. It is said that the forest is alive with creatures that have never been seen by human eyes, creatures that hunt in the darkness and leave no trace of their victims. A seasoned trapper, familiar with the area, decided to venture into the Darkwood, confident in his skills. As night fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive silence. The trapper felt eyes on him, hundreds of eyes, watching from the shadows. His flashlight barely pierced the darkness, revealing only fleeting glimpses of movement. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the trapper knew he was not alone. The eyes in the darkness were closing in, moving silently through the trees. Panic set in as the trapper tried to find his way back, but the forest had become a maze, the trees closing in around him. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was a pair of glowing eyes, staring at him from the depths of the forest. By morning, the trapper was gone, his camp abandoned and his tracks leading nowhere. The locals say that the eyes in the Darkwood had claimed him, adding his soul to the countless others that have disappeared in its depths. Story 31. The Whispering Mist. In the forests of Washington state, there's a dense patch of woods that the locals avoid, especially on foggy nights. They called it the Whispering Mist. It's said that when the fog rolls in, it carries voices, soft, seductive whispers that lure travelers deeper into the woods, never to be seen again. A park ranger, new to the area, decided to investigate the rumors after a series of hikers went missing. One evening, as the mist began to rise, he ventured into the woods, confident that he could solve the mystery. But as he walked, the whispers began, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. Then they grew louder, more insistent, beckoning him forward. The ranger felt a compulsion to follow the voices, his mind clouding with each step. The trees grew denser, the path fading into the mist. He tried to turn back, but the whispers surrounded him, filling his head with thoughts that weren't his own. By the time the sun rose, the ranger was gone, the mist dispersing as if it had never been there. The locals say the whispering mist had claimed another soul, drawing him into the fog where he now joins the chorus of voices that lure the unwary to their doom. Story 32. The Cursed Lantern. In the remote woods of the Appalachian Mountains, there's a legend about a cursed lantern that appears to travelers who have lost their way. It's said to be carried by the ghost of a miner who died in a cave-in, doomed to wander the woods forever. A group of spelunkers, exploring the old mining tunnels, found themselves lost after a cave-in blocked their path. As they tried to find their way out, they saw a faint light in the distance, flickering like a lantern. Relieved, they'd followed the light, but as they drew closer, they realized something was wrong. The light led them deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the air colder. The lantern, swinging gently from side to side, revealed the figure of a man in old mining gear, his face pale and gaunt. He said nothing, only continued walking, the light drawing the spelunkers onward. By the time they realized they were being led astray, it was too late. The trees closed in around them, the ground beneath them turning to mud. The last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them was the miner's lantern, glowing faintly in the distance. By morning, the campsite was found empty, the gear abandoned. The locals say the cursed lantern had claimed them, leading them to a fate worse than death. Story 33. The Wailing Pines. In the forests of Northern California, there is a grove of pines that is said to wail like a banshee on windy nights. The locals call it the Wailing Pines, and they believe that the trees are the spirits of women who were wronged and killed by their lovers, their souls forever trapped in the wood. A couple, on a weekend camping trip, decided to spend the night in the grove, despite the warnings from the locals. As the wind picked up, they began to hear the wailing, a high, mournful cry that seemed to come from the trees themselves. The sound grew louder, more desperate, as the night wore on. The couple tried to leave, but the wind had become a gale, the trees swaying violently, their branches whipping through the air like claws. The wailing became unbearable, filling their minds with sorrow and despair. The trees seemed to close in around them, their trunks twisting and contorting like tormented souls. By morning, the grove was silent, the wind gone, and the couple was never seen again. The locals say the Wailing Pines had claimed them, adding their souls to the chorus of sorrow that haunts the grove. Story 34. The Phantom Logger. In the forests of Oregon, there is a legend about a phantom logger who appears to those who dare to cut down the old-growth trees. The logger is said to have been killed by a falling tree, his spirit doomed to protect the forest from those who would harm it. A logging crew, hired to clear a section of forest, began their work despite the warnings from the locals. As they felled the first tree, a cold wind swept through the forest, and the sound of an axe echoed through the trees, though none of the men were swinging. The crew laughed it off, but as they continued, the phantom logger appeared. A figure dressed in old, worn-out clothes, his face obscured by a shadow. He said nothing, only stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them with cold, empty eyes. The crew, unnerved, tried to leave, but the forest had other plans. The trees began to sway, the ground shaking as if alive. The sound of the axe grew louder, more frantic, as if the phantom logger was cutting down the trees around them. By morning, the clearing was empty, the logging equipment abandoned. The locals say the phantom logger had claimed the crew, taking them as punishment for their disrespect of the forest. Story 35. The Forgotten Church. Deep in the woods of the southern United States, there is an old, abandoned church that is said to be cursed. The church was built by a small congregation that vanished without a trace, leaving the building to rot in the wilderness. The locals say that the church is haunted by the spirits of those who died in some terrible, unknown event, and that anyone who enters the church will never leave. A group of urban explorers, drawn by the legend, set out to find the church. After days of searching, they finally stumbled upon it, a small, dilapidated building hidden deep within the trees. As they approached, the air grew heavy, and the sounds of the forest faded away. Inside, the church was dark and cold, the pews covered in dust, the altar broken and forgotten. The explorers began to feel a sense of dread, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The walls began to close in, the air growing colder, as the spirits of the forgotten congregation rose from the shadows. The explorers tried to escape, but the church had become a prison, the spirits pulling them deeper into the darkness. By morning, the church was silent once again, the explorers gone without a trace. The locals say that the church had claimed them, adding their souls to the cursed congregation that haunts atolls. Story 36. The Dark Trail. In the forests of Montana, there is a trail that is said to lead to nowhere, a path that appears and disappears without warning. The locals call it the Dark Trail, and they believe that it is a portal to another world, a place where the lost are taken and never return. A hiker, eager for a challenge, decided to follow the trail, despite the warnings from the locals. As he walked, the trail seemed to stretch out before him, winding through the dense forest like a serpent. The trees grew closer together, the air growing thick and heavy. The hiker began to feel a sense of unease, as if the forest was alive and watching him. The trail grew darker, the trees closing in around him, their branches reaching out like claws. The hiker tried to turn back, but the trail had vanished, replaced by an endless sea of trees. Panic set in as he realized he was lost, the forest twisting and turning like a labyrinth. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the trees moving of their own accord. By nightfall, the hiker was never seen again. The locals say the dark trail had claimed him, taking him to a place where time and space no longer existed. Story 37. The Screaming Hollow. In the forests of West Virginia, there is a hollow that is said to scream like a banshee on dark, stormy nights. The locals call it the Screaming Hollow, and they believe that it is haunted by the spirits of those who died in a terrible mining accident many years ago. A group of friends on a weekend camping trip decided to spend the night in the hollow despite the warnings from the locals. As the storm rolled in, the wind began to howl, the trees swaying violently in the gale. The hollow, once peaceful, became a place of terror as the screams began, high-pitched, desperate cries that seemed to come from the earth itself. The friends tried to leave, but the wind had become a storm, trapping them within the hollow. The ground beneath them shook, the trees closing in around them, their branches whipping through the air like claws. The screams grew louder, more desperate, as if the spirits of the miners were reaching out for help. By morning, the hollow was silent once again, the storm gone, and the friends were never seen again. The locals say the Screaming Hollow had claimed them, adding their souls to the chorus of screams that haunt the hollow. Story 38. The Hunter's Revenge. In the forests of Maine, there is a story about a hunter who was wronged by his fellow trappers and left to die in the wilderness. His spirit, filled with rage and a desire for revenge, is said to haunt the woods, hunting down those who dare to enter his territory. A group of trappers new to the area decided to set up camp in the woods, despite the warnings from the locals. As they set their traps, they began to notice strange things. Tools went missing. Traps were sprung without catching anything, and at night they heard the sound of footsteps in the dark. At first, they thought it was just an animal, but as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The figure of a man, dressed in old hunting gear, began to appear at the edge of their camp, his face twisted in anger. The trappers, unnerved, tried to leave, but the forest had other plans. The trees closed in around them, the path back to their cabin vanishing in the darkness. The hunter's revenge had come, and he would not rest until he had claimed them all. By morning, the camp was empty, the trappers gone without a trace. The locals say the hunter had claimed his revenge, taking their souls to join him in his eternal hunt. Story 39. The Dark Figure. In the deep woods of Pennsylvania, there is a legend about a dark figure that haunts the old logging roads. The figure is said to be the ghost of a logger who died in a terrible accident, his spirit doomed to wander the forest, seeking revenge on those who dared to trespass. A couple, on a late-night drive, decided to take a shortcut through the woods, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. As they drove down the old logging road, the trees grew thicker, the air colder. The headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. A tall, shadowy figure, its face hidden in darkness. The couple tried to swerve, but the figure didn't move, forcing them to stop. The dark figure slowly approached the car, its eyes glowing in the night. Panic set in as the couple realized they were trapped, the car refusing to start, the doors locked from the inside. The dark figure reached out, its hand passing through the glass as if it weren't there. The couple screamed, but no one heard them. By morning, the car was found abandoned, the couple gone without a trace. The locals say the dark figure had claimed them, taking their souls to join him in his eternal vigil on the old logging road. Story 40. The Hanging Tree. In the forests of Georgia, there is a tree that is said to be cursed, a hanging tree, where many were lynched in the dark days of the past. The locals say that the tree is haunted by the spirits of those who died there, their souls trapped in the twisted branches. A group of teenagers on a dare decided to visit the tree at night, despite the warnings from the locals. As they approached, the air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the wind whispered through the leaves like the voices of the dead. The tree, tall and gnarled, seemed to sway in the breeze, its branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The teenagers, laughing nervously, began to hear strange noises, creaking like the sound of rope pulling taut, and the soft, desperate gasps of those who were hanged. The tree's shadow loomed over them, growing darker and more menacing with each passing moment. Panic set in as the teenagers realized they were not alone. The spirits of the dead had risen from the ground, their ghostly forms hanging from the branches, their eyes pleading for help that would never come. The teenagers tried to leave, but the tree's roots seemed to come alive, wrapping around their feet, pulling them closer. By morning, the tree stood silent and alone, the teenagers gone without a trace. The locals say the hanging tree had claimed them, adding their souls to the countless others that haunt its twisted branches. Story 41. The Ghost of Silver Creek. In the deep woods of Kentucky, there is a creek known as Silver Creek, where the water runs cold and clear. The locals say that the creek is haunted by the ghost of a young man who drowned there many years ago. It is said that on moonlit nights, his ghost can be seen walking along the water's edge, searching for something he lost. A fisherman, drawn by the legend, decided to try his luck at the creek, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost. As he cast his line, the water suddenly grew still, the usual sounds of the forest falling silent. A thick mist began to rise from the creek, obscuring his view. Through the fog, he saw a figure, a pale, ghostly figure, its eyes vacant and expressionless. The fisherman felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of sorrow, as if the weight of the ghost's grief was pressing down on him. The ghost reached out, its fingers brushing against the fisherman's arm, and he felt a cold that seemed to seep into his very soul. Terrified, he tried to flee, but the mist had closed in around him, the air thick with the smell of decay. By morning, the fisherman was found lying on the bank, his face pale and his body cold. The locals say the ghost of Silver Creek had claimed him, taking his soul to join the countless others that haunt its waters. Story 42. The Midnight Ride. In the forests of Massachusetts, there is a road that is said to be haunted by the ghost of a Revolutionary War soldier who was killed on a midnight ride. The locals say that on dark, moonless nights, you can hear the sound of hooves pounding on the dirt road, followed by the ghostly figure of a rider on a black horse. A group of friends, on a late-night drive, decided to take the road, hoping to see the ghost for themselves. As they drove, the trees closed in around them, the air growing colder. The sound of hooves began to echo through the forest, growing louder with each passing moment. The friends laughed nervously, but their laughter died in their throats as a figure appeared in the rearview mirror, a rider on a black horse, his face obscured by the shadows. The friends tried to speed up, but the car wouldn't respond, the road stretching out before them like an endless tunnel. The rider drew closer, his horse's hooves pounding like thunder on the dirt road. Panic set in as the friends realized they were trapped, the road leading them deeper into the forest, with no way out. By morning, the car was found abandoned, the friends gone without a trace. The locals say the ghostly rider had claimed them, taking their souls to join him on his eternal midnight ride. Story 43. The Witch's Curse. In the deep woods of Virginia, there is a cabin that is said to be cursed by a witch who was burned at the stake many years ago. The locals say that anyone who enters the cabin will be cursed, their lives filled with misfortune and tragedy. A group of friends, eager for a scare, decided to spend the night in the cabin, despite the warnings from the locals. As they settled in, the air grew thick with the smell of smoke, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and the temperature dropped to an icy chill. The friends laughed it off at first, but as the night wore on, the sense of dread grew stronger. The cabin seemed to come alive, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath their feet. The witch's curse had taken hold, filling their minds with fear and paranoia. By morning, the cabin was empty, the friends gone without a trace. The locals say the witch had claimed them, adding their souls to the countless others that have been cursed by her dark magic. Story 44. The Crying Child. In the forests of North Carolina, there is a story about a child who was lost in the woods and never found. The locals say that on dark, stormy nights, you can hear the child crying, his voice echoing through the trees. A couple, on a weekend camping trip, decided to spend the night in the woods, despite the warnings from the locals. As the storm rolled in, they began to hear the sound of a child crying, faint at first, then growing louder. The couple, thinking it was a lost child, set out to find him, but the crying seemed to move through the trees, leading them deeper into the forest. The storm grew more intense, the wind howling through the trees, the rain lashing at their faces. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as if the child was just out of reach. The couple tried to find their way back, but the forest had become a maze, the trees twisting and turning like a living wall. The crying grew more frantic, the sound filling their minds with fear and despair. By morning, the forest was silent, the storm gone. and the couple was never seen again. The locals say the crying child had claimed them, taking their souls to join him in his eternal search for home. Story 45. The Phantom Riverboat. In the swamps of Louisiana, there is a riverboat that is said to be haunted by the ghosts of those who died in a terrible fire many years ago. The locals say that on foggy nights, you can see the riverboat gliding through the swamp, its deck filled with ghostly figures. A group of tourists on a nighttime swamp tour decided to investigate the legend, despite the warnings from their guide. As they floated through the mist, the sound of a distant whistle echoed through the swamp, followed by the faint glow of lanterns. The riverboat appeared through the fog, its deck filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in pain and sorrow. The tourists, curious and excited, drew closer, but as they did, the air grew cold, and the sound of crackling flames filled their ears. The riverboat, once a beacon of light, became a nightmare, the flames licking at its wooden frame, the ghostly figures reaching out for help that would never come. The tourists tried to turn back, but the swamp had become a maze, the mist closing in around them. By morning, the riverboat was gone, and the tourists were never seen again. The locals say the phantom riverboat had claimed them, taking their souls to join the countless others that haunt its charred remains. Story 46. The Curse of the Black Cat. In the forests of Maryland, there is a story about a black cat that is said to be cursed. The locals say that the cat was once a witch's familiar, and that anyone who crosses its path will be cursed with bad luck and tragedy. A young woman, driving through the forest late at night, saw a black cat cross the road in front of her. She thought nothing of it, but as she continued driving, strange things began to happen. The car's engine sputtered, the headlights flickered, and the radio filled with static. The woman, unnerved, tried to turn back, but the road had become a maze, the trees closing in around her. The black cat appeared again, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its fur standing on end. The woman, terrified, tried to speed up, but the car wouldn't respond. The cat seemed to be everywhere at once, its eyes watching her from the shadows. The woman felt a growing sense of dread, as if the cat's curse was taking hold. By morning, the car was found abandoned, the woman gone without a trace. The locals say the black cat had claimed her, taking her soul to join the countless others that have fallen victim to its curse. Story 47. The Ghostly Ferryman. In the forests of New Hampshire, there is a river that is said to be haunted by the ghost of a ferryman who drowned many years ago. The locals say that on foggy nights, you can see his ghostly figure rowing a boat across the river, his face twisted in pain and sorrow. A fisherman, on a late-night trip, decided to cross the river in his small boat, despite the warnings from the locals. As he rowed, the mist began to rise, obscuring his view. The sound of water lapping against the boat grew louder, more frantic, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Through the fog, the fisherman saw a figure, a pale, ghostly figure, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his eyes vacant and expressionless. The ferryman, rowing a boat that seemed to glide effortlessly through the water, beckoned the fisherman to follow him. The fisherman, terrified, tried to turn back, but the river had become a torrent, the water swirling around him like a whirlpool. The ferryman's boat drew closer, the ghostly figure reaching out to pull the fisherman into the icy depths. By morning, the boat was found empty, the fisherman gone without a trace. The locals say the ghostly ferryman had claimed him, taking his soul to join him on his eternal voyage across the river. Story 48. The Forest of Lost Souls. In the forests of Ohio, there is a stretch of woods that is said to be a place where the lost are taken, their souls trapped forever in the darkness. The locals call it the Forest of Lost Souls, and they believe that it is a place where the dead wander, searching for a way out. A group of hikers, new to the area, decided to explore the forest, despite the warnings from the locals. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The path became a twisted maze, leading them in circles. The hikers began to see strange things, figures moving in the shadows, whispers in the wind, and the faint glow of ghostly lights. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the hikers knew they were not alone. The forest had become a place of terror, the trees whispering secrets that filled their minds with fear and despair. The hikers tried to find their way back, but the forest had other plans. The ground shifted beneath their feet, the trees moving of their own accord, trapping them in the darkness. By morning, the forest was silent, the hikers gone without a trace. The locals say the forest of lost souls had claimed them, taking their souls to join the countless others that wander its dark and twisted paths. Story 49. The Haunting of Raven's Peak. In the forests of Colorado, there is a mountain known as Raven's Peak, where the locals say that the spirits of the dead come to rest. It is said that the mountain is haunted by the ghosts of those who died in tragic accidents, their souls trapped in the mist that clings to the peak. A group of climbers, eager for a challenge, decided to scale Raven's Peak, despite the warnings from the locals. As they climbed, the air grew colder, the mist thickening around them. The path became treacherous, the rocks slick with ice, and the wind howled like a banshee. The climbers began to feel a sense of dread, as if the mountain itself was alive, watching them with cold, empty eyes. The mist grew thicker, obscuring their view, and strange sounds filled the air, whispers, cries, and the distant echo of falling rocks. The climbers knew they were not alone. The spirits of the dead had risen from the mist, their ghostly forms fleeing through the air like shadows. The climbers tried to turn back, but the path had vanished, replaced by a sheer cliff that dropped into an endless abyss. The last thing they saw before the mist consumed them was the ghostly figure of a raven, its wings outstretched, its eyes glowing in the darkness. By morning, the mountain was silent once again, the climbers gone without a trace. The locals say Raven's Peak had claimed them, taking their souls to join the countless others that haunt its mist-covered slopes. Story 50. The Curse of the Blood Moon. In the forests of Utah, there is a legend about a curse that strikes on the night of a blood moon. The locals say that on these nights, the forest comes alive with dark magic, and those who venture into the woods will never return. A group of campers, unaware of the legend, decided to spend the night in the woods, eager to witness the rare blood moon. As the moon rose, the sky turned a deep, blood red, casting an eerie glow over the forest. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The campers began to hear strange noises, whispers, growls, and the rustling of leaves, as if something was moving through the trees. The forest, once peaceful, had become a place of terror, the shadows growing darker, the trees twisting and turning like a living wall. The campers tried to leave, but the forest had become a labyrinth, the path back to their campsite vanishing in the darkness. The curse of the blood moon had taken hold, filling their minds with fear and despair. By morning, the forest was silent, the blood moon gone, and the campers were never seen again. The locals say the curse of the blood moon had claimed them, taking their souls to join the countless others that have fallen victim to its dark magic. Story 51. The Shadow in the Fog. In the forests of northern Idaho, there's a dense fog that rolls in every few months, thick enough to swallow the tallest trees and the bravest souls. The locals know to stay indoors when the fog comes, for it is said that a shadow moves within it, a creature born of darkness and mist. A photographer, hoping to capture the beauty of the fog-covered woods, ventured out one morning despite the warnings. As he set up his camera, the fog thickened, wrapping around him like a living thing. The trees disappeared, the path vanished, and he was left in a world of white and gray. As he snapped his first picture, he noticed something strange in the viewfinder, a dark shape, barely visible in the fog. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but the shadow began to move, growing larger with each passing second. The photographer felt an icy chill crawl up his spine as the shadow took form, a tall, faceless figure that seemed to be made of the fog itself. Panic set in as he realized the shadow was moving toward him. He tried to run, but the fog had closed in around him, disorienting him, pulling him deeper into the woods. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the shadow, reaching out with long misty fingers. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the photographer was never seen again. The locals say the shadow in the fog had claimed him, pulling him into a place where light and warmth can never reach. Story 52. The Watcher in the Woods. In the remote forests of Minnesota, there's a story about a watcher, a being that lives deep within the woods, observing those who dare to enter its domain. It is said that the Watcher is neither human nor animal, but something ancient and powerful, bound to the forest by dark magic. A solo hiker, seeking solitude, set out on a journey through the untouched wilderness, unaware of the legends. As she hiked deeper into the woods, she began to feel uneasy, as if someone or something was watching her. The trees grew taller, the shadows darker, and the silence was broken only by the sound of her own footsteps. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, so intense that she could almost feel eyes on her back. As night fell, she set up camp, but sleep eluded her. The forest was too quiet, too still, and every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. Then, in the darkness, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the shadows. The watcher had found her. It moved closer, its presence oppressive and terrifying. She tried to flee, but the forest seemed to conspire against her, the trees blocking her path, the underbrush tangling around her feet. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the watcher, its eyes filled with an ancient, unknowable hunger. By morning, her campsite was found abandoned, her belongings untouched. The locals say the watcher had claimed her, adding her to the countless souls it has taken over the centuries. Story 53. The Haunted Bridge. In the forests of Maine, there is an old rickety bridge that crosses a deep ravine. The locals call it the Haunted Bridge, for it is said that those who cross it at night will hear the footsteps of those who have fallen to their deaths below. A group of college students on a dare decided to cross the bridge under the light of the full moon, despite the warnings. As they stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaked and groaned under their weight. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the trees like a mournful wail. Halfway across, they began to hear it, soft, shuffling footsteps, as if someone was walking just behind them. The students laughed nervously, but the footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until they could feel the presence of someone or something following them. Panic set in as they realized the footsteps were not their own. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness below swallowing all light. The last student, bringing up the rear, suddenly felt a cold hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. He screamed, but his friends were already too far ahead, their footsteps drowned out by the sound of the wind and the creaking wood. By morning, the bridge was empty, the last student gone without a trace. The locals say the haunted bridge had claimed him, pulling him into the darkness below to join the souls of the others who have met their fate there. Story 54. The Vanishing Trail. In the forests of Vermont, there is a trail that is said to lead travelers to their doom. Locals call it the Vanishing Trail because those who follow it are never seen again. The trail appears normal at first, winding through beautiful, dense woods, but as one goes deeper, the surroundings begin to change, subtly at first, then more dramatically. A seasoned hiker, drawn by the trail's mysterious reputation, decided to follow it to see where it led. As he walked, he noticed the trees growing closer together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The birds stopped singing, and the usual sounds of the forest faded away. The trail became narrow, the ground soft and unstable, as if it were pulling him deeper into the earth. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. When the hiker tried to turn back, he found that the path had disappeared, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. The forest was no longer a place of beauty, but a living, breathing entity intent on consuming him. The trees seemed to close in, their branches wrapping around him like a cage. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the trail ahead, disappearing into nothingness. By morning, the hiker was gone, leaving only his footprints, which faded into the forest floor. The locals say the vanishing trail had claimed another victim, pulling him into a world from which there is no return. Story 55. The Echoing Screams. In the forests of northern Michigan, there's a stretch of woods where it is said that the screams of the dead echo through the trees. The locals avoid the area, especially at night, when the screams are said to be at their loudest. It's believed that the screams belong to a group of pioneers who were ambushed and killed by a rival group, their souls trapped in the forest, unable to find peace. A group of paranormal investigators, skeptical of the stories, decided to spend the night in the woods to capture evidence of the phenomenon. As darkness fell, the forest grew eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. The investigators set up their equipment, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed with nothing but silence, and just as they began to pack up, the first scream pierced the night. It was a sound of pure terror, filled with pain and desperation. Then came another and another, until the forest was alive with the echoes of the dead. The investigators, terrified, realized the screams were getting closer, surrounding them. The trees seemed to amplify the sound, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. The air grew cold, their breath visible in the dim light of their flashlights. Panic set in as the investigators tried to flee, but the forest had become a maze, the path back to their vehicle vanishing into the darkness. The last thing they heard, before the screams drowned out their thoughts, was the sound of footsteps, fast and frantic, as if something was chasing them. By morning, the investigators were gone, their equipment left behind, still recording the echoing screams. The locals say the forest had claimed them, their voices now joining the chorus of the dead. Story 56. The Shapeshifter's Lair. In the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, there's a legend about a creature that can take on any form it desires, known as the shapeshifter. The locals believe that this creature is a guardian of the forest, punishing those who disrespect nature by luring them into its lair and trapping them there forever. A group of hunters, ignoring the warnings, entered the forest in search of game. They were experienced and confident, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, they began to notice strange things. The tracks they were following seemed to change, leading them in circles. One moment they would see deer tracks, the next, bear tracks, then human footprints. The hunters, confused, began to argue, blaming each other for losing the trail. As night fell, they made camp, but the unease only grew. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees changing shape, the shadows moving with a life of their own. One of the hunters ventured away from the camp to gather firewood, but when he didn't return, the others went looking for him. They found his footprints leading to a clearing, but the man was nowhere to be seen. Instead, they saw a figure in the distance, just beyond the tree line, beckoning them to follow. The figure looked familiar, but as they approached, it shifted, becoming something else entirely, something inhuman. The hunters realized too late that they had been lured into the shapeshifter's lair. The forest closed in around them, the trees towering above like prison walls. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the shapeshifter, shifting between forms, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent.